Now, negotiators from almost 200 countries attended the just concluded annual climate change conference in Marrakesh. It was titled COP22 for about 2 weeks. Now, it was an opportunity to showcase progress and start the important process of turning the UN's Paris Agreement into a detailed blueprint for action. Nigeria was also part of the countries that attended this particular summit. And now the negotiators affirmed their commitment to the full implementation of this agreement. Now, remember that the Paris Agreement sets out the goals and framework for international climate change, which include cutting emissions rapidly and helping vulnerable nations to adapt to climate impacts, as well as build their own clean energy, sustainable futures, and near full decarbonization of energy around 2040. Dolapo Oni is the head of energy research at Ecobank, and he joins me now to take a look at some of these issues, particularly looking at the energy issues and how it affects Nigeria, especially as they're talking about reducing emissions. So good morning to you, Dolapo.
Good morning, Harriet. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. Global leaders, once again, let's just put in perspective what was actually talked about at that Marrakesh COP22. They once again called for more action to combat challenges of climate change, including greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think that world leaders are doing enough to address the problems?
Okay, the first meeting they had last year, and I'd even say it was this meeting, we haven't really seen specific details of how they plan to monitor and curb, emissions, and carbon generally. But part of what I think was the success of this particular meeting is that they've agreed to now work on a rule book. And that rule book essentially would then spell out in specific, details how each country will report what they are doing to cut their greenhouse emissions and how they are monitoring it, and then will provide a sort of universal way of ensuring that countries are actually working towards that goal. Because essentially what you find is that a lot of the rich countries say that they will do it, that they will try and reduce emissions, but they are not necessarily making any real steps towards it. Again, another area where we're seeing some failings is that a lot of the rich countries, which are actually responsible for the bulk of these emissions as well, have made pledges in the past to support some of the smaller countries who are more vulnerable to greenhouse emissions or changes in the climate and temperature and water, sea levels, are actually reneging on those pledges. They've not lived up to those pledges. So it's a meeting that I think achieved that one particular success, and I think that's something to look forward to.
Well, Dolapo, one of the goals set out in the Paris Agreement is to help vulnerable nations adapt to climate impacts and build their own clean energy. And I know for a very long time you've been part of those who have been driving for, sustainable clean energy for Nigeria. What are the issues you think are for Nigeria regarding energy diversification, getting clean energy and sustaining it?
I'm a big fan of clean energy, but at the same time, I think I'd like to also be very pragmatic. Nigeria needs energy, and whether it's clean or dirty at this point, I think for Nigeria's development, we probably can't pay too much. We can't get too involved in development of like solar or wind and adding that to our national grid. In some limited capacity, we can. And we should, and I think we're actually doing a lot on that front. We've signed PPAs for, over 1,300 megawatts of solar energy expected on stream or on grid next year. We're also developing several other initiatives around renewable energy. But what has been the challenge in Nigeria and still remains a major challenge is on the commercial side of power, of the power sector in Nigeria. We still don't have the right kind of tariffs. Even conventional energy sources like gas, wind, coal, we don't have the right kind of tariffs to ensure that those sort of power plants can actually function properly, commercially and profitably, let alone the renewable energy platforms, which are very front cost heavy. Most of the cost for those sort of investments are front-loaded. So you really need some very flexible sort of tariff structure. We recently passed the renewable feed-in tariff late last year, but that hasn't really kicked in yet. So we're expecting that if we can work out the details around how the commercials would work, especially get to a market where tariffs can actually be very cost-reflective, then we can actually start to include more and more of these renewable energy sources in our energy mix. But at the moment, the bulk of the development in that space is off-grid, and I think that's where we're likely to see more developments going forward.
But Dolapo, we seem to always have issues with regards setting the right tariffs that are cost reflective at this time, and looking at the fact that the conversation seems to be moving faster than we are. How would you rate the reaction in terms of putting an appropriate price mechanism that will actually reflect the realities that we're in?
You know, the best way is always to allow the market determine prices when it comes to the market. When it comes to prices, especially for things as basic as electricity, fuel, you know, it's always key to let the market be the one to set it. The dynamic in Nigeria is that, again, when you look at our exchange rate, it has a major impact on this thing as well, because, you know, when we're talking about tariffs back in 2013, when we're prioritizing the oil sector and the power sector, we were looking at exchange rates at 155. But today we're looking at exchange rates with a range of maybe 305 to 455. So depending on which rate you're looking at, tariffs have actually lagged behind the exchange rate, and because most of these power producers are buying their energies for their fuel sources in dollars and having to generate their revenue in naira, there's a significant gap that tariffs are not able to fill just purely because of the exchange rate differentials alone. So again, but if we allow the market set that, clearly tariffs would have had to rise significantly. Quite significantly, but at the same time, it would have ensured that then these operations are able to go on as commercially viable as possible, and then we're able to introduce cheaper means of energy like renewables, which wouldn't have cost us as much in terms of dollars, or because all you're carrying in terms of foreign exchange cost will be maybe just the equipment that you need, but then the fuel source or the energy, the main source for the power, which is wind or solar, wouldn't have cost you anything. So again, like I said, the best around the commercials is really to allow the market set this kind of prices, and I think that's where we're trying to push the system towards. But like you said yourself, we haven't progressed as fast as we're seeing it elsewhere.
But then let's remember that very recently the Minister of Finance in New York actually talked about, when we're talking about the cheaper renewable, you talked about solar, you talked about wind, you didn't talk about coal. I remember that there's been conversations with regards using coal to generate electricity, very critical electricity. Do you think that in line with what this COP22 is trying to focus on, and the Paris Agreement, do you think Nigeria should still be looking at the option of using coal to generate electricity?
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to quote and possibly paraphrase the environmental minister. She said it, I think, at the last COP meeting, not the Marrakesh one, the one before the Marrakesh one. And she said that, look, we're going to use whatever energy source we can to generate energy, at least to support our development. And I think that's very key. Coal is also a very useful energy source. We have some significant coal deposits in Nigeria, so we should consider it. In some limited quantity, we should be able to introduce coal. The key thing you want to achieve is to ensure that you have a very diverse energy mix. Now we have gas, we have hydro. If we can introduce coal, I think it will be excellent as well, to some limited extent. And then over the long time, when we've been able to stabilize our tariffs, our generation, what our actual peak demand is, you know, and we've got everybody as much as we can on the grid, then we can gradually start to replace some of these energy sources with more renewables, reduce the coal, maybe add more solar, reduce the wind, reduce the gas, add more wind, and so on until we have a more cleaner energy mix.
So, if you were to prioritize now, and in order of scale of preference, how would you say the federal government should look at this issue in line with wanting to be, you know, party to the Paris Agreement? Should it be gas, hydro, wind, solar, coal, or from bottom up?
I probably wouldn't even follow that route, but I'd say we should look at coal also too quite well. I'm still an advocate of coal, at least until we get our base load capacity sorted. So gas, maybe gas, hydro, coal, solar, and possibly wind. Because again, if you look at Nigeria's geography, we don't have capacity for all this in various locations. So, for instance, if you are looking at the north, especially towards the northeast, that's where you have the concentration for solar. Wind is more toward the southern part of the country. So again, it's a limited quantities that we can develop these mixes. But in terms of priority, I'd say gas. Let's sort out the gas issues. Let's get more coal on grid. Let's get hydro if we can. We've got Mambila project going on as well. And then let's get some solar, which we're doing also. Let's increase that quantity, and then some wind.
Well, thank you so much, Dolapo, for joining me on the program this morning. Of course, we'll continue to keep our eye on this particular issues. It's something that has continued to generate conversation, even though we're trying to, most of the countries are trying to achieve low carbon emission. You can't take away from the fact that it's really important for you to have enough energy, and the only way for you to do that is to look at what you have comparative advantage in. Nigeria has got a large deposit of coal, and like the Minister of Finance, Mrs. Kemi Adeosun, said, they will be looking at using that to generate power as well. And Dolapo has rightly pointed out what needs to be done. Dolapo Oni, head of energy research at Ecobank.